There's a substance in your kitchen more addictive than cocaine, more profitable than oil, and more responsible for modern disease than any virus in history. It wasn't always there. For most of human existence, it didn't exist in the quantities we consume today. But in just 1 century, it rewired our biology, our economy, and our destiny. It changed the way our cells communicate, the way our brains process pleasure, and the way our bodies store energy. It turned food into something our ancestors wouldn't recognize. It made childhood diabetes possible. It made obesity epidemic. It made chronic disease the norm rather than the exception. This is the story of sugar, the invention that addicted the world and corrupted our health in a century of disease, and how it turned the human body into a profit machine, a biochemical factory designed not for health, but for endless consumption and perpetual craving. Welcome to the Hidden Plate channel. Episode 2, Sugar, the invention that addicted the world and corrupted our health in a century of disease.
Sugar is everywhere now. In bread, in sauce, in medicine, in infant formula, in products labeled healthy and natural, in foods you would never suspect. We consume, on average, over 150 pounds of it per year, more than our ancestors ate in a lifetime. Some estimates place it even higher when you account for all the hidden sources and chemical variants. But sugar, as we know it today, is not ancient. It's not natural to the human diet in these concentrations. It's an invention, a carefully engineered commodity born from slavery, refined by industry, and marketed as innocent. For centuries, it was rare, expensive, reserved for royalty and the wealthy elite. A luxury that required vast resources to produce and transport. Then came the mills, the plantations, the factories, the Industrial Revolution, the chemical refinement processes, and with them, a transformation so complete that we forgot what food tasted like before it. We forgot what it meant to eat seasonally, to taste the natural sweetness of a ripe fruit as a rare pleasure, to go days or weeks without consuming concentrated sweetness. This episode traces the rise of sugar from luxury spice to universal poison, from cane fields in the Caribbean to the bloodstreams of billions, from a symbol of wealth and power to a vector of disease and metabolic dysfunction. We'll examine the economic forces that made it ubiquitous, the marketing campaigns that made it acceptable, and the physiological mechanisms that made it destructive. We'll follow the money, the science, and the consequences. Because understanding sugar means understanding how modern food was created, who benefits from our consumption, and why changing it requires more than individual willpower. It requires recognizing that we're fighting against a system designed to keep us eating, craving, and buying more. We dedicate hours of research to uncover what truly shaped our plates. If you value this kind of work, support it, subscribe, leave a comment, or share this story. We create the content, you keep it alive. Before sugar, sweetness was rare. Honey from wild hives, requiring courage and smoke to harvest. Fruit in season, available only for brief windows each year. The occasional drip of tree sap, collected laboriously in small quantities. Sweetness was a reward, not a right. It came with effort, with patience, with respect for the rhythm of nature. In medieval Europe, a single teaspoon of sugar cost what a laborer earned in a day. It was kept in locked cabinets, stored in ornate containers, displayed like jewelry at banquets, given as dowries to cement marriages between noble families. To taste it was to taste power, to experience something the common person might encounter only a handful of times in their entire life. But the human body didn't crave it the way it does now, because it had never been trained to. The dopamine pathways in the brain hadn't been repeatedly activated by concentrated sweetness from infancy. The taste receptors on the tongue hadn't been desensitized by constant exposure to hyperpalatable foods.
There were no sugar-coated cereals for children, no advertisements teaching them that breakfast should taste like candy, no sodas at every meal, no vending machines in every hallway, no convenience stores on every corner selling concentrated sweetness in portable form. No hidden fructose in every packaged food, disguised under dozens of different names. People ate what grew within walking distance, what spoiled if not preserved carefully, what required fire and time and skill to transform from raw ingredient into meal. Their teeth didn't rot by 30, their jawbones didn't deteriorate from chronic dental disease, their children didn't develop type 2 diabetes before puberty, their bodies didn't accumulate visceral fat around vital organs, and their blood didn't thicken with the sludge of metabolic disease. Their arteries didn't calcify from chronic inflammation and insulin resistance. The archaeological record tells us something remarkable. Before the modern era, cavities were rare. Skeletal remains from pre-industrial populations show strong teeth, dense bones, and little evidence of the metabolic diseases that plague us today. When anthropologists examine traditional diets from around the world, from the Inuit to the Maasai to Pacific Islanders, they find an extraordinary diversity of foods, but one common thread: the absence of concentrated, refined sweeteners consumed daily. Sweetness back then was an event, a celebration, a harvest festival, a wedding feast, not a baseline, not an expectation, not something consumed multiple times daily, beginning before breakfast and continuing until bedtime, and certainly not an addiction, not a substance that could create physical dependence, withdrawal symptoms, and compulsive seeking behavior. Our ancestors' relationship with sweet foods was fundamentally different from ours. They didn't need it, didn't expect it, and didn't suffer when it was absent. Their biology was calibrated to a world where sweetness signaled ripe fruit or honey, rare sources of quick energy that should be consumed when available because they wouldn't be available for long.
The sugar trade didn't begin with health. It didn't emerge from a desire to nourish populations or improve quality of life. It began with empire, with the cold calculation of profit margins and global domination. In the 1600s, European powers realized that a tropical grass called sugarcane could be turned into white gold, a commodity so valuable it could finance wars, build navies, and establish colonies. But it required something darker than soil, something more fundamental than agricultural knowledge. It required labor, vast, endless, expendable labor that could toil in brutal heat, that could be worked to death and replaced, that could transform violent exploitation into crystalline sweetness. So they built an industry on the backs of enslaved Africans, creating what historians now call the triangle trade. Ships carried manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, where they were traded for human beings. Those human beings were transported in unimaginable conditions across the Atlantic to Caribbean and South American plantations. There, they were worked to death producing sugar, which was then shipped back to Europe to feed growing demand. The cycle repeated over and over for centuries. Millions of lives ground down in Caribbean plantations to feed Europe's growing sweet tooth, their bodies literally consumed by the process of sugar production. The mortality rate on sugar plantations was so high that the enslaved population couldn't sustain itself through reproduction. Plantation owners calculated that it was more economical to work people to death within 7 years and buy new captives than to provide conditions that would allow them to survive longer. The heat, the physical demands of cutting cane with machetes, the dangerous machinery of the mills, the tropical diseases, the inadequate food and shelter, all combined to create a death machine more efficient than war. Sugar became the most traded commodity in the world, generating more wealth than any other agricultural product, more valuable than tobacco, which would eventually create its own health crisis, more brutal than cotton, which would fuel the American South's slave economy, By the 1700s, sugar had reshaped global economics, driving the expansion of slavery, financing European industrialization, and creating some of the largest fortunes in history. The banking systems of London and Amsterdam were built on sugar money. The mansions of Bristol and Liverpool were sugar palaces. The museums and universities we admire today were often founded with sugar wealth. By the 1800s, new technology arrived, the steam-powered refinery. Suddenly, sugar could be mass-produced on a scale previously unimaginable. The Industrial Revolution's machinery could be applied to sugar processing, whitened through chemical processes involving bone char and lime, crystallized with precision, packaged for distribution, transported via expanding railway networks and steamship routes. It went from luxury to necessity almost overnight, at least in the perception of European and American consumers who had developed an insatiable appetite for sweetness. And when slavery formally ended, abolished through decades of activism and moral awakening, the system didn't actually disappear. It just moved to Hawaii, where Asian workers were recruited under contracts that barely disguised their bondage, to the Philippines, where American colonial power ensured continued extraction, to Brazil, where plantation agriculture continued under different legal frameworks but similar power dynamics. Different faces, same exploitation. The same brutal labor conditions, the same disregard for human life, just under new management and new legal terminology. But now, sugar wasn't just for the rich. It was for everyone. Or so the story went. In reality, it was being systematically introduced into the diets of working-class populations as a cheap source of calories, a way to make insufficient wages stretch further, a way to provide quick energy for factory workers whose labor drove industrial capitalism. And that's when the real transformation began, when sugar moved from the luxury goods consumed by aristocrats to the daily staple of common people, when it became not just a commodity, but a cornerstone of modern diet. Because when you make poison cheap, when you subsidize its production and distribution, when you build entire food systems around it, when you train generations to expect it and crave it, you make it universal. You make it inescapable. You make it the foundation of what we call food. By the early 20th century, sugar was no longer sold as a luxury, no longer marketed as an exotic spice from distant lands. It was sold as energy, as pure fuel for the body and mind, as purity itself, refined and white and clean, stripped of any color or impurity that might suggest something natural or complex. As love, as the ingredient that transforms a simple meal into a special occasion, that shows you care about your family. The marketing was brilliant, insidious, and everywhere. Advertisements showed smiling mothers spooning sugar into their children's milk, teaching them early that love tastes sweet. Doctors recommended it for fatigue, for nervous exhaustion, for underweight children who needed to gain mass. Medical journals, funded by sugar interests, published articles extolling its benefits. Home economics classes, the curricula often influenced by industry, taught housewives that sugar was an essential part of every meal. Cookbooks proliferated with recipes that called for cups of sugar where tablespoons had once sufficed. The sugar industry formed powerful trade organizations with innocuous names: the Sugar Association, the Sugar Research Foundation. They funded research, but not the kind of research designed to uncover truth. They funded research designed to produce favorable results, to create scientific cover for continued consumption. In the 1960s, internal documents later revealed through investigative journalism that sugar executives paid scientists at Harvard to downplay sugar's role in cardiovascular illness. They commissioned literature reviews that minimized evidence linking sugar to heart disease. They pointed the finger at saturated fat instead, at butter and eggs and meat, creating a nutritional scapegoat that would dominate dietary guidelines for generations. And it worked. Spectacularly.
For decades, the world feared butter and eggs, avoided red meat, switched to margarine made from industrial seed oils. Dietary guidelines recommended reducing fat consumption, which meant that something had to replace those calories. That something was sugar and refined carbohydrates. Low-fat products flooded the market, and to make them palatable without fat, manufacturers added sugar. Lots of sugar. Low-fat yogurt became a sugar delivery system. Low-fat cookies, low-fat salad dressing, all of it loaded with sweeteners. Meanwhile, sugar quietly colonized every aisle of the supermarket, infiltrated every category of food. It wasn't just in obvious places like candy and desserts, it was in bread, giving it a longer shelf life and more appealing taste. It was in pasta sauce, in soup and crackers, in cured meats. It was in products marketed as healthy: granola bars, breakfast cereals, fruit juice, energy drinks, vitamin water. The grocery store became a maze where avoiding sugar required reading every label, understanding ingredient lists, recognizing the many names under which sugar hides. Sugar gives you energy, the advertisements proclaimed, showing athletes and active children. And it's technically true. Sugar does provide quick energy. What they didn't mention was the crash that follows, the blood sugar spike and subsequent plummet that leaves you more tired than before. A spoonful helps the medicine go down, sang Mary Poppins, teaching children that medicine should taste like candy, that bitter or unpleasant flavors should be masked rather than accepted. Part of a balanced breakfast appeared on cereal boxes, depicting tables laden with juice, toast, and milk, a breakfast that was actually mostly sugar in various forms. But behind the slogans, behind the cheerful images and catchy jingles, something else was happening, something the marketing didn't prepare people for. Obesity rates began to climb, first gradually, then exponentially. In the 1960s, obesity affected about 13% of American adults. By 2000, it was over 30%. By 2020, over 42%. The curve wasn't just increasing, it was accelerating. Type 2 diabetes, once called adult onset because it typically appeared in people over 50, started appearing in children. First as rare case reports that shocked pediatricians, then as a growing trend, then as an epidemic. 10-year-olds with a disease that had once been exclusively geriatric. Tooth decay became epidemic despite fluoridated water and improved dental care. Dentists saw children with mouths full of cavities, teeth that needed to be pulled before adolescence. The phenomenon was so common it earned a name: baby bottle tooth decay, caused by letting infants fall asleep with bottles of juice or sweetened milk. And still, the message remained, unchanged and unchallenged in mainstream nutrition advice: sugar is fine. In moderation, just don't overdo it. Exercise more. It's about balance. But moderation became impossible, not because people lacked willpower, but because sugar wasn't just in candy anymore. It was engineered into the food supply at every level. It was in ketchup, with some brands containing more sugar per tablespoon than ice cream, in crackers marketed as savory snacks, in healthy yogurt that contained as much sugar as soda, in bread, in peanut butter, in coleslaw, in marinades, in salad dressing, in granola. It was hidden behind nutrition labels that didn't clearly indicate total sugar content, renamed to avoid detection, disguised as dozens of different ingredients that consumers wouldn't recognize as sugar. High-fructose corn syrup, developed in the 1970s as a cheap alternative to cane sugar, had rapidly adopted by the food industry. Dextrose, maltodextrin, agave nectar, marketed as a natural alternative despite being nearly pure fructose, fruit juice concentrate, which sounds healthy but is essentially sugar with vitamins, evaporated cane juice, a marketing term designed to avoid using the word sugar, barley malt, rice syrup, date sugar, coconut sugar. The list goes on. A testament to the industry's creativity in obscuring what should be simple information. The average person couldn't avoid it even if they tried, even if they read every label and cooked every meal from scratch.
because sugar had become so ubiquitous, so fundamental to modern food processing, that avoiding it meant essentially opting out of the conventional food system entirely. It meant shopping at farmers markets, cooking everything from basic ingredients, making your own condiments and snacks. It meant spending more money and vastly more time. It meant social isolation, being unable to eat at most restaurants or accept most dinner invitations. And that was the point. The food industry understood something fundamental about addiction. The best way to ensure continued consumption is to make the addictive substance unavoidable, to build it into the fabric of daily life so thoroughly that abstaining requires heroic effort. They understood that if sugar was everywhere, if it was the default rather than the exception, people would consume it constantly without even thinking about it. And they were right. These truths rarely reach mainstream media, for obvious reasons. If you believe more people should know what's behind what we eat, share this video now. One click helps spread real awareness.
By the year 2000, something unprecedented had happened in human history. For the first time ever, more people were dying from the consequences of overeating than from starvation. The World Health Organization documented this crossover point, this moment when abundance became more deadly than scarcity. The body, designed by millions of years of evolution to survive scarcity, to store every possible calorie against future famine, was drowning in abundance. And sugar was the flood, the rising tide that overwhelmed our ancestral biology. When you consume sugar, particularly in the quantities modern diets provide, your liver processes it like alcohol. In fact, the metabolic pathway is nearly identical. Fructose, the sweet half of table sugar, goes directly to the liver where it must be processed. In small amounts, from whole fruit consumed occasionally, this is fine. But in large amounts, from concentrated sources consumed constantly, it overwhelms the liver's capacity. The liver converts the excess fructose into fat through a process called lipogenesis. This fat accumulates in the liver itself, creating non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, a condition that was virtually unknown before 1980 and now affects nearly 25% of the global population. But the liver is just the beginning. Sugar triggers insulin spikes, rapid surges of this crucial hormone that tells cells to absorb glucose from the bloodstream. In a healthy system, insulin rises after meals and then returns to baseline. But when you consume sugar frequently throughout the day, insulin stays chronically elevated. Cells are constantly being told to absorb glucose. Over time, they become resistant, like someone who stops hearing a sound that's constantly present. They require more and more insulin to respond. The pancreas works harder to produce enough insulin to overcome this resistance. Eventually, it can't keep up. Blood sugar rises. That's prediabetes. When the pancreas finally fails to produce enough insulin, that's type 2 diabetes. But it doesn't stop there. The consequences cascade through every system of the body. Sugar feeds cancer cells, which consume glucose at rates far higher than normal cells. PET scans used to detect cancer work by injecting radioactive glucose and seeing where it accumulates. Oncologists have known for decades that cancer cells are sugar addicts. Multiple studies suggest that high sugar diets correlate with increased cancer rates, though the exact mechanisms are still being researched. Some researchers believe insulin resistance and chronic inflammation create conditions that promote cancer development. Sugar accelerates aging at the cellular level through a process called glycation. Glucose molecules bind to proteins and fats in the bloodstream, creating substances called advanced glycation end products, or AGEs. These damaged molecules accumulate in tissues, making skin less elastic, damaging the kidneys, clouding the lenses of eyes. AGEs are one reason diabetes causes such widespread complications. Diabetic retinopathy leading to blindness, diabetic nephropathy requiring dialysis, diabetic neuropathy causing pain and numbness.
It damages the lining of blood vessels, contributing to atherosclerosis and heart disease. High blood sugar is abrasive to the delicate endothelial cells that line arteries. This damage triggers inflammation and the formation of plaques. The American Heart Association, after decades of blaming dietary fat, now acknowledges that added sugars are a major risk factor for cardiovascular disease. The very institution that once recommended low-fat diets high in carbohydrates has reversed its position based on accumulating evidence. It disrupts the gut microbiome, the trillions of bacteria that inhabit our digestive tract and play crucial roles in immunity, mental health, and metabolism. Beneficial bacteria that digest fiber and produce short-chain fatty acids decline on high-sugar diets. Harmful bacteria that promote inflammation proliferate. The gut barrier becomes permeable, allowing bacterial fragments into the bloodstream and triggering systemic inflammation. Researchers are discovering connections between gut health and nearly every chronic disease. And it alters brain chemistry in ways that mirror addiction to drugs. This isn't metaphor or exaggeration. MRI scans show that sugar activates the same reward centers as cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin. The nucleus accumbens lights up, dopamine floods synapses, the brain's pleasure circuits fire intensely. And like with drugs, tolerance builds. The more you eat, the more you need to achieve the same level of satisfaction. What once felt indulgent becomes necessary. What once felt sweet becomes merely adequate. Cravings intensify, becoming intrusive thoughts, preoccupations, overwhelming urges.
Withdrawal is real and physiologically measurable. People who cut sugar from their diet experience irritability, headaches, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, intense cravings, mood swings. Brain scans during sugar withdrawal show patterns similar to drug withdrawal. The symptoms typically last a week to 10 days, sometimes longer for heavy consumers. This isn't weakness or imagination. It's a physiological response to removing a substance the brain has come to depend on for dopamine release. And it begins in childhood, earlier than most people realize. Infant formula contains sugar. Baby food is sweetened. Toddler snacks are designed to taste like candy. Children's medications are flavored with sweeteners to improve compliance. By the time a child enters school, they've already been conditioned to expect everything to taste sweet, to associate eating with pleasure rather than nourishment, to view unsweetened foods as somehow deficient or punishing. Their taste receptors are already calibrated to high sweetness. Their dopamine pathways are already wired to expect frequent sugar hits. Today, nearly half of American adults have prediabetes or diabetes. That's not a typo. Half. Over 130 million people with blood sugar dysregulation, whether they know it or not. Many are undiagnosed, unaware that their bodies are already failing to process glucose properly. 1 in 3 children born in the year 2000 will develop diabetes in their lifetime, according to CDC projections. Think about that. Not 1 in 1,000, not 1 in 100, but 1 in 3. This is not a disease of genetic misfortune affecting an unlucky few. This is a population-wide disaster. Metabolic disease is now the leading cause of death worldwide, surpassing infectious disease in the late 20th century and continuing to climb. Not war, which kills millions. Not famine, which still devastates parts of the world. Not violence, not accidents, not infections. Metabolic disease, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, kidney disease, liver disease. All connected, all driven largely by diet, all preventable. Sugar, hidden in plain sight, normalized as a daily staple, endorsed by governments who subsidize its production, subsidized by agricultural policies that make corn syrup cheaper than water in some cases, and defended by an industry that generates hundreds of billions in annual revenue. The economic incentives are overwhelming. Food companies know that sugar makes food more palatable, more addictive, more likely to be purchased repeatedly. They know that sweetness triggers pleasure centers, that people will choose sweeter products over less sweet competitors. They employ food scientists who understand the bliss point, the precise amount of sugar that maximizes consumption without triggering disgust. They test products with consumers to find the formulation that will be most addictive. And they lobby governments to prevent regulation, funding political campaigns, creating front groups with scientific-sounding names, threatening economic consequences if sugar is taxed or restricted. We didn't choose this. Individual consumers didn't decide to create a food system based on sugar. We didn't vote to have it added to virtually every processed food. We didn't ask for our children to be marketed to with cartoon characters and playground promotions. We didn't request that our agricultural subsidies favor corn and sugar production over vegetables and fruits. It was chosen for us by economic forces, by industries that profit from our consumption, by political systems that respond to lobbying more than public health, that prioritizes quarterly earnings over generational consequences. Capitalist logic.
But something is shifting. In labs, kitchens, and living rooms around the world, people are waking up to what's been done to them and their children. The awakening isn't universal or complete, but it's real and it's spreading. Researchers like Robert Lustig began exposing sugar's toxic effects in the 2000s through lectures and papers that went viral, reaching millions outside academic channels. His 2009 lecture, Sugar, the Bitter Truth, accumulated millions of views, introducing mainstream audiences to concepts like fructose metabolism and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Documentaries started connecting the dots that official nutrition guidance had obscured. Fed Up examined the childhood obesity crisis. That Sugar film tracked one man's health decline on a high-sugar diet. The Perfect Human Diet explored evolutionary nutrition. Independent journalists investigated the sugar industry's manipulation of research. Whistleblowers from inside food companies revealed how products are engineered for maximum consumption. Scientists who had been ignored for decades suddenly found audiences hungry for information that explained their own experiences. Ordinary people began reading labels and realizing they'd been lied to. They discovered that products marketed as healthy, products they'd been feeding their children, were primarily sugar. They realized that natural meant nothing, that no artificial ingredients didn't mean nutritious. They learned to look past the front-of-package marketing to the ingredient list and nutrition facts. They started asking uncomfortable questions. Why is there sugar in bread? Why do I feel terrible an hour after eating breakfast cereal? Why are my children so difficult to manage after birthday parties? Communities formed, not around restrictive diets or weight loss schemes, but around truth and shared experience. Online forums where people discussed navigating a food system designed to make them sick. Local groups that organized sugar-free challenges and potlucks. Parents who connected over the experience of watching their children's behavior transform when candy and juice were eliminated. Athletes who discovered they performed better on whole foods. People with autoimmune diseases who found relief through dietary changes their doctors never suggested. Parents stopped buying juice boxes, realizing they were essentially sugar water with minimal nutritional value. They stopped believing that children need constant snacks, that kids can't wait a few hours between meals. They stopped using food as a primary reward or comfort, teaching children that emotions can be processed without eating. Athletes cut processed foods and discovered they recovered faster, performed better, had more stable energy. Entire countries started taking action. Mexico, facing an obesity crisis, implemented taxes on sugary drinks. Chile created warning labels for high-sugar foods and banned cartoon characters from unhealthy products marketed to children. Berkeley, California became the first U.S. city to tax soda. Some cities banned soda in schools, removing vending machines and replacing sugary beverages with water and milk. Some hospitals, ironically often filled with diabetic patients, removed soda from their cafeterias. Some workplaces stopped providing donuts and cookies at meetings. These weren't sweeping revolutions, weren't mandates from above.
They were small decisions made by individuals and communities who recognized that the status quo was killing them.
It wasn't a revolution. It was a quiet rebellion, a turning away from industrial food and back towards something older and more sustainable. A return to cooking, to spending time in kitchens rather than drive-thrus, to ingredients you can pronounce, foods that come from specific places rather than laboratories, to meals that don't come in plastic, that spoil if not eaten within days, that require preparation and attention, to the simple, radical act of asking, what is this actually made of, and who profits from my consumption? This return isn't nostalgic or romantic, it's pragmatic. It's people recognizing that they feel better, that their children behave better, that their medical problems improve when they eat real food. It's physicians who are tired of prescribing medications for preventable diseases, beginning to counsel patients about diet with the same urgency they'd counsel them to quit smoking. It's researchers conducting studies showing that dietary interventions often outperform pharmaceutical interventions for metabolic diseases. It's a growing recognition that we've been systematically deceived about something fundamental to human health. And as people cut sugar from their lives, something remarkable happened. Weight dropped, often without calorie counting or portion control, simply because the addictive drive to overeat diminished. Energy returned, stable throughout the day rather than spiking and crashing. Inflammation faded, joints hurt less, skin cleared, chronic pain improved, mental clarity increased, brain fog lifted, focus sharpened, sleep improved, mood stabilized, anxiety decreased. Chronic conditions, once considered permanent and progressive, began to reverse. Type 2 diabetes, that doctors said would require lifelong medication, went into remission. Fatty liver disease resolved, blood pressure normalized, cholesterol profiles improved, autoimmune symptoms quieted, migraines decreased in frequency and severity, IBS improved, acne cleared. These weren't miracle cures or placebo effects. They were the natural result of removing a toxic substance and giving the body what it actually needs. Not because of medicine, not because of expensive treatments or invasive procedures, but because the poison was removed. Because the constant barrage of sugar and refined carbohydrates ceased, because insulin levels returned to normal, because inflammation decreased, because the gut microbiome recovered, because the liver could finally process the fat it had accumulated, because cells regained insulin sensitivity. The body, it turns out, still remembers, despite decades of abuse, despite years of metabolic dysfunction, despite carrying the consequences of a toxic diet, it still knows how to heal. The human body is remarkably resilient, designed by evolution to recover from damage, to adapt, to survive. If you let it, if you stop the continuous damage, if you provide what it needs rather than what industry wants to sell you. The healing isn't always complete or immediate. Some damage is permanent, but the capacity for recovery far exceeds what most people believe possible. We're rebuilding the forgotten story of human nutrition, but it only continues if you're part of it. Subscribe, comment your thoughts, and suggest the next topic. This project exists because of you.
Sugar didn't conquer the world by accident or by natural selection of consumer preferences. It conquered it through strategy, through deliberate effort by powerful interests who understood that controlling food meant controlling populations. Through lobbying that shaped agricultural policy and dietary guidelines. Through science for sale, researchers who produced favorable results in exchange for funding. Through the slow erosion of cultural memory, the forgetting of what food used to be and how people used to eat. It replaced fat in our food during the low-fat craze, making products less satiating and less nutritious. It replaced fruit in our children's hands, substituting whole foods with candy and juice boxes. It replaced meals with snacks, teaching us to eat constantly throughout the day rather than at defined meal times. And hunger, true physiological hunger, was replaced with craving,
the addictive drive for more sweetness regardless of actual nutritional need. And in doing so, it made us sick. Not acutely, not with immediate obvious symptoms that would cause alarm, not with dramatic poisonings that would lead to recalls and lawsuits, but slowly, over years and decades, methodically, following the predictable course of metabolic dysfunction. Generationally, with each cohort sicker and heavier than the last, with children developing diseases their grandparents never encountered. But here's what they didn't count on, what the architects of industrial food couldn't fully control. The body keeps score. It maintains a record of what's been done to it, and eventually people notice. They notice the exhaustion that no amount of sleep fixes, the brain fog that makes thinking difficult, the medical bills that pile up, the prescriptions that multiply, the warning signs their bodies send in the form of expanding waistlines, rising blood sugar, increasing blood pressure. They notice their children struggling with things that didn't exist a generation ago: type 2 diabetes in 8-year-olds, anxiety and depression at epidemic levels, attention problems that require medication, obesity in toddlers. They notice that the official guidance doesn't seem to work, that following the food pyramid or MyPlate or low-fat recommendations doesn't prevent disease. And they start asking questions. They start researching. They start experimenting with their own diets. They start trusting their own experiences over official pronouncements. Food is memory. What we eat connects us to our ancestors, to place, to culture. The recipes passed down through generations, the seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest, the communal knowledge of how to transform raw ingredients into nourishment. And our memory was rewritten by corporations who replaced those connections with brands, with convenience, with standardized industrial products that taste the same everywhere. They gave us convenience and took our health. They gave us choice and took our knowledge. But every choice we make, every ingredient we reject, every time we choose an apple over a granola bar, every time we cook instead of ordering, every time we read a label and put something back on the shelf, is a small act of rebellion against a system that views us as nothing more than consumers to be exploited. A vote for a different future, cast with our dollars and our forks, one where sweetness is rare again, special, meaningful, where it's earned through the effort of harvesting honey or waiting for fruit to ripen, not engineered in laboratories to maximize addiction. Where the plate is ours again, not a battlefield where industry fights for stomach share and profit margins. Sugar will not disappear overnight. The industries built around it are too powerful, too entrenched, too profitable. The subsidies that support corn and sugar production won't be reversed without political struggle. The food companies won't voluntarily reformulate their most profitable products. The restaurants won't stop serving supersized sodas without consumer demand or regulation forcing change. But neither will we disappear. Neither will the growing awareness. Neither will the parents who've watched their children transform. Neither will the diabetics who've reversed their condition. Neither will the doctors who've seen the evidence. Neither will the researchers who continue documenting the damage. The awakening, once begun, doesn't stop. It spreads through families, through communities, through social networks online and offline. And each person who wakes up makes it easier for the next person to see the truth that's been hidden in plain sight.
We stand at a crossroads in human history. One path leads deeper into the metabolic crisis that sugar has created, toward a future where the majority of the population is chronically ill, where children are sicker than their parents, where healthcare systems collapse under the weight of preventable disease. The other path leads back to real food, to eating like our ancestors did, to a relationship with sweetness that honors rather than exploits our biology. Which path we take isn't predetermined. It's being decided right now, with every meal, every purchase, every conversation about what we feed our children. The food industry wants you to believe you're powerless, that individual choices don't matter, that you should just accept their products as inevitable. But they're wrong. Every person who stops consuming their poison is a threat to their profit model.
Every child who grows up without a sugar addiction is a customer they've lost forever. Every community that chooses health over convenience is a rebellion they cannot suppress. If this story made you think, help us keep it alive. Subscribe, comment, and share. That's how you become part of this investigation. Tomorrow, we'll reveal another hidden truth behind what ended up on our plates. The food system doesn't change because governments declare it should. It changes because enough people refuse to participate in their own poisoning, because enough parents demand better for their children, because enough communities recognize that health is worth fighting for. That fight begins with knowledge. And knowledge begins with stories like this one, with investigations that connect the historical dots, with exposing the economic incentives that shaped our plates. Thank you for watching. Thank you for questioning. Thank you for being part of the awakening.